Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is World War II veteran and retired U.S. Army Colonel Frank Kohn. In all, he spent 35 years in uniform in service to our country, all after being forced to escape Germany as a child following the rise of Adolf Hitler. And Mr. Kohn, it's an honor to have you with us, sir. Thanks for your time.
Well, thank you.
Your story begins a little bit differently than most World War II veterans because you were actually born in Germany. So describe what you remember of your family life there and what it was like then after Hitler came to power.
Well, I was born in 1925, and at that time, Germany was still a democracy. But in 1933, Hitler came to power, and that had an immediate impact on our family. My father had a sporting goods store, and when Hitler came to power, it was immediately picketed by stormtroopers who indicated to people that they shouldn't buy from Jews. And my father saw the light right away and sold the business. And after that, it was rather difficult for him to sustain himself economically. And things were getting more and more difficult for the Jews in Germany. One could impact that even as a child. You could see it, where you were not allowed to go into certain restaurants because they didn't desire to have Jews as customers. You were restricted in doing various things in the arts and such. And in the school, as a matter of fact, one of my teachers, who I really loved in the second grade, when he came back in the third grade, he was wearing a Hitler uniform. And all the kids in the class started to wear Hitler Youth paraphernalia. And it was obvious that I was no longer desired in that class, and my parents took me out and put me into a private school. And things went sour after that economically, and my father, at my 13th birthday, right after that, went to the States to see if he could find some relatives who could give him an affidavit so we could emigrate to the United States. As it was, he found his relatives, but there was, of course, the economic problems in the United States, the Depression, where they could not offer an affidavit which gave a guarantee that the person or persons would not become a burden to the state. They were economically not able to do that. So he stayed longer in order to see if he could find someone else who would give it to him. And during that interim, the Gestapo came to our house and was looking for him, and he would have been arrested. My mother told him to stay in the States if he could. And after another couple of weeks or so, we had, there was a so-called British lady placed into our apartment who obviously was supposed to monitor what we were doing. And my mother indicated to me and asked me, do you think we should leave? And without hesitation, even though I had just gotten a new bicycle, a BMW bicycle.
Nice.
I had a good position on the soccer team with my friends, and I had a lot of friends. Without hesitation, I said, let's go. And she was able to secure a visitor's visa, and with that, even placed me on the visa. And we, one fine morning, just took off with a suitcase each, 10 marks each. That's all we were allowed to take out. Got on a train, first to Berlin to say goodbye to her family, my grandfather, my aunt, and such. We got on a train to Holland, and on the boat, Holland America Line to Statendam. We ended up in New York with our visitor's visa on October 30th, 1938. On November 9th, 1938 was Crystal Night, and President Roosevelt issued an executive order that indicated anyone in country in the United States could stay there and would not be forced to return to Germany. And that's how we were saved.
Let me go back to that third grade classroom just for a
Yes.
moment. Did it surprise you how quickly and easily people took up the ideas and the paraphernalia of the Third Reich, or do you think they were just scared to defy it?
Well, I guess as a kid, you take things as they come. You don't think much about it. But it was obvious that things changed the minute Hitler took power. The friends I had who were German immediately left. We were no longer friendly. That was it. It was an immediate cutoff of the friendship. And then in the school, it became difficult for me because all the other kids were singing Hitler songs. And when they sang those, they had to stand up. And because I wasn't allowed to sing it, I had to sit down. And the kid that's sitting down when everybody else is standing up is going to be picked on, and I was picked on. It was lucky I was a pretty fast runner, and I was able to escape all of the time. They never did catch me.
Fantastic. Wow.
They weren't my schoolmates didn't really harass me personally, but the word went out, and other kids knew I was Jewish, and they're the ones who chased me. But I was always able to get home before they caught me.
No wonder you were such a
But
good soccer
I had to
player.
get out of there.
Wow. So you found residence in the United States, and where did your family settle after that?
Well, we stayed in New York, and I went to school in New York on junior high school, 7th grade, and then on to Stuyvesant High School. And I took one summer term of college when the draft caught me. I was 18 in August of 1943 and drafted in September 1943. And I was an enemy alien at that point. So I stayed in the reception center at Fort Dix for about 2 months while the FBI investigated me. And obviously I got a green light and I went on.
So were you initially frustrated that your college education got interrupted, or were you looking to join the fight against Adolf
No,
Hitler at
I
that
was
point?
ready to go.
Okay.
I just went to college because I was waiting to be drafted. I knew
So you knew
I
it
was
was
going to
coming.
be drafted. I didn't know how quickly. As a enemy alien, I was not allowed to volunteer, so I had to wait for the draft.
Gotcha. Where did they send you for training?
Uh, I went to basic training, and at that time I was designated for the Army Specialized Training Program. That was a program that took anyone who had gone to college. They were going to give you basic training and then send you back to college to get a degree. It was rather ridiculous because a degree wouldn't have been until about 1946, and the war would have been well over. So when I finished basic training, somebody's light went on in their brain and they changed the whole thing. And all of us destined to college went to the 87th Infantry Division because they needed infantry replacements. They knew that the invasion was coming and they knew they're going to need infantry. And so I went to that. I was hurt in a demonstration problem. We were training against gas attack because in World War I the Germans used gas, and somebody wanted to make it realistic and drew a grenade was supposed to be smoke. It ended up being white phosphorus, and luckily I had a gas mask on. My pack caught fire, and I took off, and I was the first one in the dispensary. When they figured out it was white phosphorus, they got my hands, which were sprayed by the white phosphorus, into a bucket of water, and they applied wet compresses around my ears, which were exposed outside of the gas mask. And I was in the hospital for about a month or two. And when I came back, they had progressed to about 25 miles with a full field pack of walking. And after 15 miles, I wasn't in shape. They had to take me back with a jeep. So somehow they decided that I was best a infantry replacement rather than staying in the division. And off I went into England, and then France, and then Belgium. And that's when they found out I spoke German. They took me back to Le Vesconnet for a 2-week course. This was a abbreviated course teaching what others had been taught in 6 months at Fort Ritchie, Maryland. And after that, as a matter of fact, I didn't even stay for the whole 2 weeks. After 1 week, they needed me so badly, and I was a full-fledged intelligence agent after 1 week of training.
Outstanding. Well, you're clearly a quick learner. Before that, as an infantry replacement, had you seen any combat before?
No, they had brought me all the way up to Malmedy, which was pretty soon to be very famous in the Battle of the Bulge. And we were in foxholes, but there was no contact. And they took me out of there and sent me back to Paris.
Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. Mr. Cohn, let's pause right there. We're speaking with retired U.S. Army Colonel Frank Cohn. He's a World War II veteran and actually 35 years in service to our country in the U.S. Army. We'll talk about more of his time in uniform in World War II, what it was like to go back to Germany, and we'll also talk about the rest of his time in uniform all the way up to the late 1970s. I'm Greg Corombos. You're listening to Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Corombos, honored to be joined in studio today by Frank Cohn, a 35-year veteran of the U.S. Army, retiring as a colonel in the late 1970s, also a World War II veteran. We've heard his gripping story all the way from his childhood, being born in Germany and, of course, persecuted, his family forced to flee, and thankfully they did so in 1938, getting to the United States, and 5 years later drafted into the U.S. Army. So, sir, when we left off, you had blitzed through the intelligence training in just a week, and we're ready to be deployed. This is right around the time of the Bulge, late 1944, early 1945. Describe your experience there.
Well, I was in they called it Interrogator Prisoner of War Team number 66 under a unit called T-Force, that's Task Force, immediately under General Bradley, 12th Army Group headquarters. And our mission was to go into the big cities as they were captured, and we would have dossiers on intelligence and building targets. Intelligence, that is, building targets were anything that was of vital interest to the U.S. forces and the occupation force. And personality targets were people under the automatic arrest policy destined to be tried for war crimes. Anyway, we arrived in Belgium around the 10th of December, 1944, and the Battle of the Bulge started just about a week later. It was, the first night was really a scary situation. Nobody knew what was going on. I was taken, or rather told, to take my M1 rifle, go on an access road to our headquarters, and make sure that no Germans would come in. This is in the dark, no communication, just a flashlight and a rifle, and no instructions except don't let Germans get in. So I'm standing there and I'm challenging vehicles, and the drivers say, well, what the heck are you doing? If we were Germans, you'd be dead. You got to get back in the bushes. So I went in the bushes, and of course I yelled for people to stop, and they didn't hear me, or they didn't want to hear me. So I was useless there. I didn't know what to do. And all the rumors that were spreading around, the Germans all around, there was firing all over the place. You didn't know what was coming off. And thank goodness around midnight they came and got me back, and we had a blackout move, convoy move towards Antwerp. We never got to Antwerp. We were going in the direction of Liège, and we stopped in Namur. And in Namur, we got a mission, and that was, there had been German soldiers who had penetrated our lines in American uniforms, 4 to a Jeep, and we were to patrol and see if we could intercept them. We really didn't intercept anybody, except we were at a roadblock where the infantry had intercepted one and had taken a bazooka and killed all 4 of them and disabled the Jeep they were going in. And we searched the bodies of these people, and all we found was American dog tags, which we confiscated because that indicated these were either POWs or they were killed. Anyway, the big problem at the time wasn't so much the enemy as it was the weather. It was cold. It was just miserable. It was either raining or sleeting or snowing, and the wind was howling. In the Jeep, our windshield had to be down because you can't fire through a windshield. And I was, as a PFC, I was in the back seat, and I could get behind the captain, and he got the brunt of the blast of the wind because I never told him that he was shielding me. But even with that shielding, it still was pretty miserable. And once your feet got wet, they were going to be wet for the entire period.
What kind of layers did you have? I've heard some people say that they basically just had the shirt on their back and not even socks sometimes.
No, we did have socks, and we had boots, and we had clothing. The clothing was okay, but it got wet, and it got soaking wet, and you still got cold. You couldn't really complain because some people had it much worse. We were able to go back to Namur into a building and sleep in a relatively warm place while many of the others were in the foxholes and couldn't get out of that. And
so no long-term frostbite for you?
Well, in Belgium, we were always taken care of. The Belgians always were willing to give us a place to stay, a room that they had, whatever. They were very, very nice people, and we really appreciated that.
Just about a minute before our next break here, during the combat over the next few weeks, what was your role during that?
Oh, well, the first town that we got into was Cologne, and Cologne, the Germans were on the other side of the river. For example, we had as a building target a caserne of military troops, and the only thing we found that was alive in there was a canary bird. It was sort of very strange. Here, the Germans had gave them enough food and water to stay for a week, and that was the only thing alive. And suddenly, the Germans must have seen our Jeep because mortar shells came over and one short, and we got just into the vehicle and got out of there before the thing would have impacted right on our Jeep. So that was personal. They were shooting at me, so I took that very personal. But anyway, after Cologne, there were various other cities that we went into. Dusseldorf, for example, we actually liberated Dusseldorf. We couldn't know whether the troops had already been in there or not. They sent me out with a driver, and as we got into Dusseldorf, we could see a roadblock up ahead and people scurrying around. And looking closer, we could see they were not putting things into the roadblock, they were removing the roadblock. And we saw all the white sheets hanging out, and we got closer and we asked somebody, as a matter of fact, all the Germans took off like mad, but we stopped at a Esso station because our tire had to be changed. It got debris into it. And we got the owner of the station who told us, no, he hadn't seen any Americans before us. So we were liberating Dusseldorf from our side, and we turned right around and turned back and said, we got to wait till the infantry goes in. We're a little bit too early.
Smart man, smart man. Colonel Cohn, thanks very much for continuing this amazing story with us. We'll be right back to continue our discussion with you in just a moment on
Sure.
Veterans Chronicles. We're back on Veterans Chronicles. Our guest today is retired U.S. Army Colonel Frank Cohn, veteran of World War II, and 35 years in service to our country. And sir, just before the break, you were talking about the Bulge and then moving on to Cologne and Dusseldorf. Go ahead and pick up the story from there.
Okay. Well, the biggest city that we hit was Frankfurt. And we got into a building next to the railroad station, and a hotel that was still in pretty fair shape. It hadn't been completely demolished. Most of Frankfurt was flat, but there it was still serviceable, and we used it as an interrogation center. And we interrogated many of the prisoners that were taken as the city fell. And one of them that I had in front of me was Prince Auwei. He was the son of the Kaiser, who happened to be a general in the Waffen-SS. And of course, he was designated as a war criminal to be tried. So he was segregated. And as we were interrogating, the word came that there was an unexploded bomb in the railroad station, and we had to immediately evacuate the motor pool that had been formed right in front of the station. And I never learned how to drive. And the sergeant told me, I can translate this to, would you please go into that Jeep and take that Jeep into another place quickly if you can. This is not exactly the way he talked. And I kept yelling that I didn't know how to drive, and he said he could not care less. So I jumped into that Jeep, and it was like a horse that hadn't been trained yet, and bucking it. And the next day, of course, I asked my buddy, teach me how to drive, because I didn't want to go through that again. Anyway, Frankfurt was interested also in terms of the IG Farben building. That building was designated as supreme headquarters for the forces, Eisenhower's headquarters, in other words, and it had not been bombed. And we got there. That should have been a first priority target. Unfortunately, it was not, and some infantry officer didn't know what to do with a bunch of refugees, and he herded them into that building. And the refugees rebelled in there and smashed everything. They took the furniture and threw it out of the windows, which they smashed out, of course. And as we came in, it was a catastrophe. We had a bomb disposal squad to go with us, and we opened the safes that were in the basement, and we confiscated all the documents to be examined later on. And then there were industrial diamonds, and they were taken by the EOD people. And then there were batches of marks, and we thought they were worthless. I knew I had gotten a big batch of marks I took back, and I distributed to all the people who couldn't get into the field to have some souvenir. And then we found out later they were 10 cents to the mark. So I must have given away thousands of dollars worth of money. Anyway, that headquarters was an interesting building. It had elevators that just kept going. They never stopped. You had to get the right timing to get into it, and then hopefully when it got to the top, it wouldn't go upside down. It didn't. It just went down flat. Anyway, that was headquarters. Later on, we went into Wiesbaden, and we liberated a Russian labor camp. And the problem there was that some of those Russians and Ukrainians had volunteered to work for the Germans, while others were forced labor taken in, and we were trying to separate the two. It was an impossibility. First of all, they didn't speak German that well, and secondly, there was accusations back and forth, and nobody could tell who was telling the truth. So that was a hopeless thing. Later on, some of them went back to Russia, and everyone there was just taken as not as a volunteer. Rather, everyone was regarded as a volunteer, not as forced labor. They just took everyone, and the girls, they shaved their hair immediately. One of them came back and reported what had happened, and after that, nobody went back to Russia anymore from that camp.
Wow.
That was after the war. Wow. Anyway, The last target station was Magdeburg. We were first to go to Kassel, but we were diverted to go to Magdeburg immediately because the Russians had already arrived on the other side of the river, and we were to have a presence on our side of the river. So we got to Magdeburg, and the captain had a top-secret map that showed the occupation zones, that which was going to be occupied by the four forces, the Russians, the French, the Brits, and us. And Magdeburg itself was going to be Russian territory. So the Russians were going to come across the Elbe River, occupy Magdeburg, and go even further to the west. But General Eisenhower had drawn a line, and the River Elbe was the line so that the two forces of the Soviets and the U.S. wouldn't intermingle. So we were not allowed to go across, and they weren't allowed to go across. And that worked very well. But my captain had the map, and he was to take it across to assure the Russians that they will get Magdeburg just to stay in place for another couple of months or so before we evacuate, and then they would come across. And he looked for an interpreter who spoke Russian, couldn't find one, turns to me and says, "You're my interpreter, come with me. I'm trying to get out of this," because I knew I wasn't going to be worth anything. I didn't speak a word of Russian. I knew one word, tovarish, which is friend. That was it. And the captain said, "I don't care, here, carry the map." So we got into a boat a German ferry boat that he commandeered, and he stood up in the middle of the river, make sure the Russians knew it was an American coming across. And when we landed, it was amazing. It was like he and I had conquered all of Germany up to the Elbe, because they embraced us, they carried us around, and they plied us with vodka. I was 19 years old. I never had a drink of vodka. And here I am. I took one drink, and I knew that was enough right then and there. Luckily, I had some cigarettes, and I gave them the cigarettes I had, and they really treated us royally. And, of course, I was worthless. I couldn't speak. They couldn't speak anything but Russian. I couldn't help them there. I couldn't help the captain, so they took him to the back. They did whatever they did, and probably got him an interpreter while I stayed talking to the Russians as best as I could. He would say, "Me, Moscow." I say, "Me, New York." "You come Moscow." I say, "You come New York." That was the way we could. Well, it took me years later until it dawned on me why we had gotten such a good reception. You see, for us, the war had been over. All the way along the Autobahn as we were going to Magdeburg, the German soldiers came to the Autobahn trying to surrender because they wanted to eat. They were hungry. They weren't going to fight. Nobody fired at us. The war was over. The Russians had to fight all the way up to the Elbe River. And when they saw us, they realized they had survived the war. And that is why we had that reception. They lived.
They finally made it, and
They
they
made
obviously
Yes.
had a longer fight on the Eastern Front than the U.S. had on the Western Front.
And
so.
the strangest part was, because I had gone across, many years later, a friend of mine who had been liaison with the Russians said, "Did you know that the Russians have a ceremony at Arlington Cemetery every year on the 25th of April, which was the date that there was the meeting of Soviet-U.S. forces at Torgau. And you met the Russians, didn't you?" I said, "Yes, but it wasn't at Torgau. I was in Magdeburg. That came a couple of days later." He said, "I don't care. That's good enough for government work. You come on to Arlington." And I attended there. And the Russians, all their, the ones who were former members of the Soviet Union, they're now separate states, they all brought, that is the ones that still were in speaking terms with the Russians, they all brought wreaths at that. And we were a bunch of veterans, and the Russian schoolgirls gave us some flowers, and we put a little flower on. And I wrote a letter to the old Senator Warner and said, "This isn't right. We should have a representation." So then they sent somebody from the protocol office, and he was just lost in this. There was some colonel, he was just lost there and didn't bring a reef. So following that, I decided we'll buy a reef. We came in with a little reef while they had these humongous reefs, but they saw us coming with a reef. We were number one to place the reef, so they were appreciating that. And then the next year was going to be the 65th anniversary, and they said, well, we'll have a big deal going. We figured I was going to be at the embassy. Well, what they did was they invited me to Russia, to Moscow, all expenses paid. And I celebrated the meeting of U.S. and Soviet forces in Moscow. And there I was treated royally, too. And every 5 years, twice more, they've invited me back.
That's fantastic. Just a few minutes left here, and I want to follow up on a couple of things.
Sure.
When you were doing the interrogating of these Germans that you were capturing,
yes,
what was their attitude? Were they frightened and looking to get leniency?
Well,
were they defiant? What were
there were two types of Germans. The ones who were draftees, let's say, they were very compliant. They knew they had lost the war a long time before that, and whatever we wanted, they were going to produce. Whatever we asked, they would answer. Then there were the other type, the SS troops, the SS Waffen-SS, or even party members. They were defiant. They were uncooperative, and it was almost useless to talk to them because they just weren't going to answer anything. And we didn't need them. We could get our information from the people who talked, so we never made a great effort to extract any information out of them. And we just cast those guys aside and put them back in the PW camp.
What was it like for you, less than a decade after they essentially forced you out of that country, to be in a position where you're now demanding information from them?
It was a feeling of greatness, really. What a difference in attitude that I was able to display. But one thing that stuck in me immediately is that the one thing we won't do, we're not going to be like them. So we weren't going to treat them the way they treated us. And that was the thing to do. And that worked for me.
You mentioned coming across the labor camp of Russians.
Yes.
Were you aware up until that point that there were labor camps, concentration camps, death camps?
Well, we did not have the full story. Concentration camps, I knew that when I was a kid because there was graffiti all over the place that said JIKZ, which meant Jews into concentration camps. Now, people didn't know exactly what was in those camps, but everybody knew they didn't want to go there. Mm-hmm. And there were always reports of ashes coming out of people who had been killed in concentration camps. So we knew about concentration camps. I was not in any of the units that liberated one of those camps, so I can't talk about how it was at liberation time. But that must have been a real miserable thing, because later on, and that was a top secret thing, that some of them were extermination camps, not just concentration camps. There were 6 extermination camps, and that was a highly prized secret on part of the Germans. So that didn't come out until we liberated those camps.
And your own family was affected by that, correct? The ones that didn't.
Yeah, and well, my family was dispersed all over many countries, and 6 out of my father's extended family and 4 out of my mother's extended family were killed in concentration camps. They were the ones that didn't find a place where they could go to, or they didn't have the money to get out.
Sir, just a couple minutes left here. Obviously, we've talked about your first couple of years in uniform with great specificity. There's another 30-plus years that you're in uniform during the Korean era, the Vietnam era. Where did your career take you after World War II?
Well, I finished college first, and I stayed in the reserve, and it was a very interesting intelligence unit that I was in. we had speakers come like one of the Rockefeller people that came and talked to us. I think it was David Rockefeller. And staying in the reserve really paid off, because whenever I got a promotion, I had all this enlisted time and the reserve time. So I always was able to get the highest pay as I was promoted. In any event, I got a commission from ROTC, regular Army, and I stayed in over the years and had various interesting jobs. Some of the occupation in Germany, and this time I was married, and my wife came with me. And from the occupation, it then went into a friendly encounter with the Germans. And the irony of it all was, at the end of my career in Germany, in my last, I had 3 tours in Germany after the war was over. I was given the equivalent of a Legion of Merit from the Germans, das Große Verdienstkreuz. They did not know who they were giving the Kreuz to, but that was irony.
Yeah, talk about coming full circle.
Yes.
Well, sir, it's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing it. Thank you for your decades of service to our country, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Retired U.S. Army Colonel Frank Cohn, veteran of World War II, on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos.